Thank you so much, Emily, for joining us today on Arisa Foundation's podcast, Native Narratives, Season 2, Episode 7. We're joined by someone who genuinely seems to bend space-time to fit more into a day, Professor Emily Cross. Emily is a dancer, cognitive neuroscientist, who now leads the Social Brain Sciences Lab at ETH Zürich. I think her career has taken her across 4 countries, if I'm not wrong, or more, and 3 continents across some of the world's leading universities. And I'm just so happy, Emily, that you've agreed to be a part of this podcast. You're like a builder of interdisciplinary bridges. You're a global voice in neuroethics, one of just 36 members of UNESCO's International Bioethics Committee. And you're awesome. As a mentor, you're also a marathoner, triathlete, superwoman, all-around powerhouse. You seem to wear many hats and somehow make them all look effortless. I don't know how you do it. But welcome. I'm very, very excited for this conversation, which I'm sure we'll move between like art, science, ethics, technology, future of being human. But I'm really grateful that you're here and you're spending this time with us and having a conversation with us on our podcast. Welcome.
Kohinoor, thank you so much for that welcome. I have absolutely categorically cannot live up to that. I think is my favorite intro ever because it covered so much terrain. But yeah, the hyperbole was real as well. But the pleasure is mutual. The pleasure is likewise coming from me to be speaking to you on this fantastic podcast to your audience. So yeah, let's dig into it.
Thank you. So Emily, for our viewers who don't know what you do, maybe some of them maybe know it, but for our listeners and viewers, how would you describe what you do, what your research is, what your day-to-day looks like?
That should be an easy question, but I think when one works across so many different disciplines and wears many hats, maybe that's not always the smartest thing to do, but I do it anyways. It's a bit of a more tricky question. So my official job title is a professor in cognitive and social neuroscience at ETH Zürich, as you said. So I spend lots of time doing research and lots of time teaching here at ETH, and of course supervising and hanging out with many brilliant students. But what is my research concern? I kind of have a few different strands, and 3 or 4 depending on how I divide them up. But one very much concerns neuroaesthetics, which is I think where you and I have so many overlapping interests and passions in our research and extracurricular lives. So interested in how the brain it responds to, gravitates towards, and processes aesthetic experiences, particularly in the performing arts. We do a bit with visual arts as well, but also how technology is shaping and changing our experience of aesthetics. These are areas that I'm really interested in that realm. I also do quite a bit of work in social robotics, coming back to this technology piece and really trying to understand what it is that drives social connections, or social collaboration, and social engagement with embodied artificial agents. And I think coming from a human neuroscience perspective, there's a lot of insights that those of us studying the human side of human-robot interaction can bring to the engineers and the computer scientists of the world. So, and of course, ETH is a great place to be working in that space. And then the final strand, for the way I'm going to be dividing it up today, I guess, concerns social interaction and social engagement between humans, and how how we coordinate our actions with others, how we make sense of others that we see moving around us in a social world, and also a bit about how expertise and experience shapes and changes these social processes. So that's a very short research snapshot of what I do.
That sounds amazing. And I know some of your work, obviously, because we've worked together, but it's so cool to see it kind of like categorized in these 3 strands as well. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about the role of technology in this, going forward in our podcast and in the conversation. But before we get to that, I'd love to hear a little bit about why you got into this kind of field. How did you kind of navigate from maybe being a dancer yourself to now doing research on dance and performing arts, but also how technology happened in your research?
So I think like many people, maybe many young people, when you begin the kind of formal higher education route, you kind of have to start picking what it is you want to study and what it is you want to do. And I was very convinced that I wanted to study acting and dancing, and I was going to university in Los Angeles, so I was like, great, I'll be close to Hollywood. I'll be moving from a very small town in the middle of America, and I'll make my big break, and it'll be a life on stage and screen for me. It's funny to think about that now. But at the same time, I was still taking a lot of classes in high school And then at the start of the university, having to do with neuroscience, having to do with psychology, with biology. And I was like, oh, I really like this science piece as well. And I think I was very lucky to be offered a role, a research assistant role in a language and memory lab at my undergrad institution. And that gave me my first ever glimpse of what it means to conduct research with human subjects, what it means to kind of have data come out of people's behaviors and analyze that data and make new conclusions and kind of chart a path into new directions. And I think that really bit me. And I really loved everything I was doing with theater and dance at the same time. So I did unsuccessfully try to combine theater, dance, and neuroscience into one major. And my university said, nah, which is fine. So I had to choose. So I kind of ended up majoring in psychology and minoring in dance, but both kind of ended up informing each other a lot more than I thought they might. But I didn't think that I'd be able to actually study dance as something in my career. I remember being told when I was finishing my undergrad, like, oh, so dance and psychology, that's what you were focused on. So you're going to be a dance therapist. I remember thinking like, oh, I'm sure that's really cool, and I'm sure people who do that, it really helps people, and it's really great. But I knew that clinical psychology wasn't for me. That wasn't where my interest was. It was more in research, and I just thought like, no, I don't want to be a dance therapist. So I was totally fine with that, but I wasn't thinking that I'd ever be able to bring kind of the brand of cognitive neuroscience I do together with dance. But I had a tremendous opportunity during my PhD, when I was also dancing in a contemporary dance company, to run a study looking at the brains of the dancers in this company as they learn new choreography. And I thought that'd be a one-off, and like, how cool is this? I'm using these tools that I'm learning how to use to answer kind of fundamental questions about the human brain and how we represent motor experience. And I'm asking this question with dancers as they learn dance. This is the coolest thing I'll ever do in my career. I've peaked at the age of like 25, and nothing else will be as exciting for me in the future. But turns out that was just the start. and yeah, I've been able to, in various different ways, kind of using dance as just like a fundamental system to model human brain activity and behavior. That's been really valuable, but also more recently, I mean, I guess it's been about 15 years now, use questions having to do with dance to use dance to answer questions having to do with aesthetics. And this is becoming a very long and boring answer, but your question about the technology piece, well, I once ran a study with dancing robots many years ago, looking at, before the study that you and I ran with dancing robots, robots were just really used as a control condition. We kind of wanted to understand kind of human movement in kind of like smooth human ways versus mechanical ways. And then we wanted to have another agent. So we ended up getting this kind of Lego robot action figure and animating it. And that was just for a control condition. But then I had to write a big grant when I was in my first faculty position, a big grant application, and I decided, you know what, I want to actually do more with robots, and I want to ask more questions about humans how they perceive robots. So I made a really big deal about how I once had this robot dance control condition in one study, and how that really has set the stage for me asking all these interesting questions in robotics. And I was very lucky that the funding agency thought that narrative made sense, and I got quite a bit of funding to do a lot in this kind of social robotics space. And now for the past decade or so, that's a really big part of what my team does. And the kind of more time I spend in that space, the more I see how valuable the perspectives that we bring from the behavioral and brain sciences to these technological spaces, but also how much the aesthetics and the performing arts and the embodiment of dance, how this is informing how my thinking is developing about how we might develop socially engaging embodied agents. So it's really quite cool.
That sounds amazing, Emily. So I have so many follow-up questions, but let me just kind of go back to what you said about theater, dance, and psychology, because I feel like, oh my gosh, that paddle is so much like mirrors a little bit of what I wanted to do when I was doing my undergrad. And we did have this double major thing happening in my university back then. And I was in the last year of my undergrad when I found that there was actually a university in Bangalore, and I was in Pune. So a bit of a distance there, that did offer a bachelor's program program that had dance, literature, and psychology as like triple majors or some version of that. And I was like, oh my gosh, why did I find out only in my last year of my undergrad? Like, I have to go back and do another undergrad then. But it worked out because I still managed to continue dancing and like do psychology and neuroscience. And I had a very similar conversation about dance therapy, and I was like, but that's really not what I want to do. It's great. I've been part of dance therapy workshops, and I don't see myself doing it or facilitating it, but I see myself being a participant. But I think that was just so relatable when you said it. But also that last part that you said about robots and involving all these different disciplines. And you said that behavioral science has so much to offer, and aesthetics as well as so much to offer to engineers and people working in this space, right? Can you give a couple of examples of how this works and what in your research and your experience have been some like really tangible applications of this interdisciplinary conversation?
Absolutely. I think there's many things, and I'll maybe touch on one or two that I think that our work has contributed most directly to. And one of them is all of the research and development that is invested in making social machines kind of socially engage with people, that the robotics industry spends billions of dollars on, and there's lots of interest in making humanoid robots. We all have visions from science fiction of from Star Wars, Star Trek, the Jetsons, other films of like what a robot assistant or helper that might help you in school or in a domestic home situation or in a hospital, what this robot might look like. So there's all this money being spent on how do we make these robots look engaging? How do we have their programming be just right? But one of the things that we found at our group, which I think is so interesting, is we try to manipulate what people believe about an agent. So we give different robots different backstories. So we tell people that this robot has like the most sophisticated human-like programming, and it's modeled after real humans and their behavior and how they act and move and perceive and kind of engage with others. Whereas, these robots are all algorithmically driven, and a lot of this work was done before the advent, of generative AI. So people's understanding in 2025 would be really different than it was in 2016 or 17 when we were running these studies. But still, what we found is that behaviorally and also kind of at the brain level, people really respond much more to robots that they think have this human origin, or this human backstory. So people rate these robots that they like their movements more. So there's an aesthetic component. They kind of find them more pleasant to look at and to engage with. And their brains, parts of their brains, are more engaged that we know are associated with perspective taking, with social cognition. So the important part here is that these robots are identical. So, as psychologists, we're tricking people to a certain extent. We're showing them the same robots, but sometimes we're giving them the covers, the introduction story that these are very human-like robots with very human origins. And sometimes we're showing them the same robots and saying, but these robots have very algorithmically computer-driven foundations. And it's just really quite remarkable to see how that shapes the brain and behavior so strongly. So when I'm speaking to engineers and roboticists, I make the point that spend all this R&D, that's great, but understand how what narrative you're shipping your machine with, and if you want this to engage with kids or to engage with people in certain contexts, you have to understand how to set people's expectations up appropriately so that they're going to see this. And of course, having a really human-like narrative can be really problematic as well, because people can be disappointed. And we have some other work going on right now trying to understand, this is called you never have a second chance to make a first impression. And for robots, that's even more the case. So if you kind of come into a room and there's a robot that looks super sophisticated and maybe very human-like, then you're going to expect it to be able to see and to hear and to operate in the environment, maybe not the same as you, but it's at least going to have perceptual access to what you have perceptual access to. And of course, many times this is just not the case. So we're trying to understand, how do you align people's expectations with what a robot can actually do? And yeah, we have some cool studies looking at how you might want to simplify robot design so people aren't terribly disappointed, because if a robot disappoints someone, not only will they stop using it, but they'll not trust it, and everything is lost if the trust between a person and a robot in whatever context is gone.
Right. Wow, that's so interesting. Some of these new studies sound super fascinating, Emily. I guess, I mean, I have, again, I feel like I always have tens and thousands of follow-up questions every time you're saying every sentence. But I think what's really interesting is this narrative that, we need to kind of start thinking about in terms of how you're selling the robot, or how, engineers and roboticists are also selling the robot or marketing it. What's the packaging it comes in, right? And the other kind of part of the story is also this uncanny valley effect that's also there in social robotics, right? Like if it's too human-like, then maybe people have this uncanny feeling, and maybe it needs to be a little bit less. And like, how do you find that balance? And I think the work you do and all this interdisciplinary kind of perspectives coming in together is solving so many of these, or trying to solve so many of these questions, right? And trying to answer them, which I think is really, really
we're trying
cool.
to take little steps towards answering them. I'd say that. So yeah.
So, like with generative AI, because I know you also touched upon that, like, do you see now a difference between people reacting to robots or embodied agents differently in like the last couple of years? Because generative AI is still like super, I mean, new in the broader context of things.
Yeah, so it's certainly making some interesting changes, and it's exacerbating some of the problems I think the social robotics research and development industries already had. And one of those problems in particular is that robots can speak a lot more smartly now. So you can walk into a robot with a humanoid robot and ask it to explain quantum physics to you, and it can do that because it's it just taps into ChatGPT or whatever its Gen AI capabilities are. But then, we spoke about this problem. So if you walk in, there's a robot standing there, humanoid robot, you ask it to explain quantum physics to you, but then you ask it to pick up the apple on the table. Like, no way can it do that. Like, there's certain robots that have been programmed, like with tons of development from certain labs that could do that. But like your general one, like if you buy a Now robot or a Naval robots or many of the robots, the humanoids that are out there right now, like that takes so much extra programming. And so the talk is really, really smart, but then the physicality remains quite dumb. And I think, or quite limited, let's be a bit more charitable here. And I think this is what ChatGPT and generative AI is really doing, is it's giving embodied robots far more sophisticated verbal abilities, and yet their physical abilities remain limited. So as that gulf continues to grow, that sets up new tensions and new problems. And that's something that I think, I've been giving a talk a few times this autumn, which is which focuses on why embodiment is AI's biggest challenge, or why it remains AI's biggest challenge. And I think, I kind of talk about 5 different reasons, but this one about generative AI making this divide between verbal abilities and physical abilities even more gaping is a really important one. And of course, like Gen AI does a lot of really useful things for conversational abilities, but then physical abilities remain stuck in the dark ages.
Yeah, that's such an interesting actually point, because I didn't actually think about this before, like in my head, I was like, oh yeah, Gen AI is kind of going, but I didn't think about this divide between verbal and physical. And I think it might be also quite new for people who are listening, maybe not new, but like also an interesting perspective just to kind of think about that, because also the interaction with robots is not that common. That is, the interaction with ChatGPT online in terms of like conversation is just so I think it's routine for a lot of people now. Like every day, I think someone or the other is using it for emails and for like chatting and for therapy also. And I mean, lots of ethical issues in that. But but talking about this advent of Gen AI or development or whatever we want to call it, what's your take on whether it's encroaching in the creative industry, or whether the art it's making is even can be even called art? Like, what's your take on that?
Oh, such a good question. and I just taught a class, the colleague as well, here at ETH, and I taught a class on AI generated art, and like, is this art or not? And like, spend a lot of time speaking with the students about like and these are ETH undergrads who kind of come from an engineering or architecture or biological sciences background. So they're all from STEM subjects, and people have really strong opinions about it being, no, this isn't art, this is something different. And I remain a bit more open-minded, or maybe a bit more broad in my conceptualization. I think some really interesting things are happening with creative people, creative minds using Gen AI in their creative processes. So, of course, I think it's a concern when people say like, I don't need to actually hire an artist or a designer to do this because I can just get Gen AI to do it. Personally, I've tried to do that myself when I need a super quick turnaround for something, and it's been pretty disappointing results. But it does exist in some situations, it'll be a really good solution. But I think in general, I don't know. I don't think we should necessarily be hanging Gen AI entirely generated with like a simple prompt artworks in national galleries in any country, anywhere. But at the same time, I think that there's been tons of, as we've written about in a recent paper, there's been tons of technology that's influenced the development of artistic practices throughout millennia and certainly centuries. So rather than kind of tamping it down and saying like this must not be used by artists, I think we want to be much more open and say, let's see how artists use this. Let's see what they come up with, and maybe it will also empower people who don't have formal artistic training to also dabble in more creative endeavors, and that's not a bad thing either. So I really am interested in this debate. I really like to talk to people about it. I'm really open to hearing kind of strong viewpoints saying absolutely. But personally, I sit more on the side of like, let's see where it goes.
Yeah, I think, and I agree with you. I think I also like to, argue is a strong word, debate or converse with people who have different perspectives, especially who are like super anti-AI and stuff. And I think for me personally, also because we did this project together, right, when we used these computer-generated dance movements. And I mean, as a dancer, I just thought that was so fascinating. Like it gave me, because I was dancing those movements that now this computer had generated for us. And I just thought like, I would never put this movement and this movement together, but it looks great, so like it
does. And I think this is one of my most favorite things about this study, because I talk about this study so often when I'm presenting work about AI generated art or other things that relate to dance and aesthetics. And like, this isn't, this, to be clear to our listeners, this wasn't a study where there's a computer generated Kohinoor dancing choreography. This is Kohinoor dancing Bharatanatyam choreography that's been sequenced by a computer in a way that wouldn't naturally happen choreographically. But because Kohinoor is such a good dancer, whenever I give the presentation and I show two different video clips of like, the veridical way of doing this Bharatanatyam sequence, and then like the kind of computer dictated like mix up of the sequence steps, but then Kohinoor is still dancing them, no one can tell, well, very few people can tell a difference between them. And of course, all the experts of Indian classical dance in the audience can see it straight away. But part of this speaks to Kohinoor's incredible artistry. But again, coming back to your point about what can AI or what can, getting computers involved in the generative process, the creative process do, it can recombine steps in ways that do it before. That's kind of cool too. I agree.
Exactly. And I think, thank you for like being so nice about my dancing skills, but I think just like,
very true.
Yeah, thank you. You're too kind, Emily. But I just think using AI as a collaborator is quite interesting. And it might lead us down some very fascinating roads, if I may say so. And of course, with ethics. And I feel like technology tends to develop a bit faster than the social, political, ethical considerations. And I think they need to go hand in hand. But maybe we need...
But they probably won't. And I don't mean to sound... a negative note here, but I will. But having been recently speaking at events with other people who come from some of the biggest Gen AI companies, it's very clear that ethics are not really on the horizon. And the way that many of these companies see it is put it out there and see what happens. And I know I just kind of said something similar about the artistic use of Gen AI, like put it out there and let's see what happens. But I think ethically and what some of the capabilities of these systems are, like this is morally irresponsible and reckless and a huge problem. So I don't have a solution. That's a bit of a negative note to sound, but I think we absolutely have to keep ethical considerations front and center, especially for developmental populations. But that's not going to make money. So in the same way.
Yeah, well, I can't remember who said this, but like at one of the talks or something that I was attending online, someone said, and I thought that was so true, that at the end of the day, it's similar to human society. Like AI is kind of also mirroring what we see every day in human society, right? So if we have biases, AI is going to have biases, and we're not a perfect society, and AI is not going to be perfect. And therefore, what you said right now about it being so important to think about ethics, especially with different communities, especially the underrepresented communities, marginalized communities, all of those, right? So it's like 100% necessary to kind of talk about that and think about that. But yeah, it doesn't make money. And I mean, I think there's a whole other podcast waiting to happen for ethics in AI and how this may,
I'll happily come back if you'll have me. So.
Well, I will always love to have you, Emily. So we'd have to do multiple episodes, I think, then with you. But yeah, we're talking about ethics in AI and technology. I'd love to know what your opinion is, or what do you think about new technologies that are coming in and being used for research, especially in neuroaesthetics? Like, what's exciting for you? What do you think is kind of like, oh my gosh, this is so cool and can't wait to do this, or can't wait to try this now, with whether that's AI, Gen AI, other technologies, neuroimaging, mobile imaging, all of that. So what's your, take on that?
Well, there's lots of new technologies that are doing very cool things. Well, I was just at an ETH conference, a social dynamics conference 2 weeks ago, and it was really interesting to see one of the ETH. So this is functional near-infrared spectroscopy. This is a type of brain imaging which lends itself reasonably well to people being mobile, moving around and interacting while they're having their brain scanned. And there was some setups there where the company is able to scan, I think it was 18 people simultaneously. So that's a pretty big group. And for those listeners who know anything about neuroimaging, normally it's one person, and then occasionally and quite remarkably, there's hyperscanning studies where there's two people. And now when you can scan 18 brains at once and see how they're synchronizing, whether they're dancing, whether they're learning from each other, whatever it may be, I think that I don't know what the data look like. I don't know if the quality is quite there yet, but I think that direction of development is super interesting in trying to understand group dynamics and group perceptions of different things at different times. And of course, you will be familiar with the NeuroLive project of Guido Orgs, which has just wrapped up in London. And they did something somewhat similar, but with EEG, with people watching live dance performances. And just, the sophistication of the analyses and the questions that you can ask when you have multiple brains being scanned while engaging with, while experiencing something at the same time, that is wildly exciting. So I think that's quite cool. And from the AI side, we've just dipping our toes and experimenting with this right now. But some of the technologies that not just do video generation, but generate realistic humans dancing, and not like in a deep fake way, more like in a let's just generate a kind of a person with whatever characteristics, but then giving choreography to AI and seeing how that's developing. I've seen so many changes just in the last year with that, and I think it's still, to me, not quite ready for use in research in the way that I'm interested, but I think that's going to be really quite interesting as well, and over the next coming years.
Wow, that sounds super interesting. I think the NeuroLife project, or these multiple people being scanned together studies, are really cool as well. I think personally, if I had access to all these resources and was able to run them myself, I would love to do that. I think it's just super cool. But what in your opinion is the application of these research studies, or these studies that are being done with these multiple people sitting together and looking at a performance with their brains hooked up to an EEG machine or an ETH machine? What do you think are direct, tangible outcomes and implications of these kind of studies? What are we understanding about the brain, maybe, or are there other implications beyond just base understanding of the science?
I think there are. I think we're building a better understanding of the brain in isolation when it does various tasks. And they can be social tasks, they can be non-social tasks, but we really have such a limited understanding of the brain in social spaces when there are others around, and when we're kind of able to look at their brains as well. So I think understanding not just the individual, but the group, when the group is kind of embodied as a group, this has so many interesting bigger, grander applications in terms of how we learn, in terms of how we are swayed or not swayed by different arguments that might be being made by a speaker or a lecturer, or in this sort of context. In terms of how we're moved, like what is it to be moved by a musical piece, a performance, a dance performance, or a film, and how is that different when we're all together watching the cinema versus when I'm watching Netflix at home by myself. So I think we're as we all know, we're inherently social creatures, and being able to to understand what's going on in the brain when it's embodied in this social context, and not just the brain, but our brains, like multiple brains together, and how, I'm feeding off the signals of those that are seated near me. I think this is again a really exciting area that has applications well beyond just like what's going on in the brain when you're at the movies with other people. So that's what I would say.
That sounds awesome. I'm so thankful that you worded it this way, because I think that really answers. In general, sometimes you get these criticisms about, but like, why do this research and why do research in the first place and stuff like that. And I think I'm just going to play this answer to them, and you've articulated it really well. I think people will be convinced by this. So I'm really happy that you said that. Thank you, Emily. But also moving on from why this research is important, I do want to kind of step into this space of, at ETH, we're also trying to kind of do a bit of research in neuroaesthetics, but more kind of empirical aesthetics, and bring art, science, technology, and community together in one space. What do you think is like the benefit of doing this? Do you see value in spaces like these or in platforms like this? And what do you think is the future of such platforms and spaces?
Do I see value? Well, if I could climb to the highest mountain and scream, yes, that's exactly what I would do. So what's the value of bringing together art, science, technology, and society? Like this is what makes us human. This is what binds us together. And we often put these disciplines and these considerations into silos. And what ERISA does is it just breaks down these walls. It takes apart these silos, and it says, no, we're going to learn from the technologists about the art. We're going to learn from the scientists about how this impacts community. And all this kind of interweaving and braiding across these different perspectives, it raises up the dialogue of communities, of the public, about what it means to be human, about what it means to be curious, about what it means to learn. It means that we don't kind of get put into these factions like, oh, I'm more of a scientific mind. Oh, that person's more creative. They're more of an artist. So it means, no, we can all talk together. We can all learn from each other. And I think there's so much intrinsic value to this approach. And there's so few organizations like ERISA that are really trying to bring this to the public awareness. And I think, the work that ERISA is doing is top notch, and it's so important, especially as societies around the world become more skeptical about, the other, and about scientific knowledge in particular. And I think, we need to fight against this anti-intellectual movement, but one of the best ways to do it is to make sure that the intellectual movement is part of the creative movement, is part of the community movement, is part of the future of technology movement. And I think this is what ERISA does so beautifully.
Oh, thank you, Emily. That's really kind. And thank you for articulating that so well again. Really appreciate that. But also, I think what you said about, this intellectual movement merging with creative, merging with community, I just feel like we've seen that with the work we do in like firsthand now. And I think I had to be aware also of my way of how I've gone about doing research in like the education system, and thinking a bit now about like decolonizing aesthetics, research or science or art in general, more broadly speaking. And I just feel like when we now work with communities, it's we've had this learning experience of like, we go with a set of expectations, and we're like, okay, we have to, I don't know, do this intervention or collect this data or whatever. And I think it's been so important for us to actually have local contributors and collaborators come work with us and like develop this in collaboration with them. Because recently we had like a team go to Kashmir, and that's obviously a very different socio-political region, lots of conflict, lots of different kind of background than where we sit in our four-walled beautiful office walls or whatever you want to call them. And for us, I think it was such a learning experience to be like, oh my gosh, there's so many factors at play, and there's not one single like scientist who can make this, or an artist who can change this, or we can't have one person in one discipline working on this. We need everybody together, including people from the local communities, to actually make an impact and take this forward. And I think that was such a big learning experience for us. we know this, this needs to be done, but I think this was just like the perfect opportunity for us to learn and grow as well in terms of like how these different facets come together. But I do agree with you. I think this all needs to happen kind of together. And I hope there are more and more platforms doing this. And I hope like we get more opportunities to do this as well. But thank you for saying that as well. And I think now I'm just going to kind of move towards the end of our podcast because we have like a few minutes left, and talk a bit about your experience as a woman working in neuroscience and tech-heavy fields, if I can call it that, but also interdisciplinary fields. What have been some of your experiences, challenges? What are the motivating aspects for you?
Well, I feel like in many ways I was somewhat lucky to have grown up. I know this makes me sound like a dinosaur, in the 80s, when I do think that they're like, if you look at the advertising and kind of like the toys that were marketed to kids back in the day, like some of my favorite toys were construction sets and like lab kits, and it wasn't like peak Barbie, like pink toys, blue toys. So I feel like I never had a narrative that this wasn't like that science, that research weren't a place for like equally welcoming for women and men. But of course, like my lived experience as becoming an actual researcher, of course I've seen that some micro and macro aggressions towards women, and working at a technical universities, it's very much part of the narrative here. There's big interest in kind of making sure there's more representation of women across the technical and engineering sciences, and every department here at ETH. Fun fact is that my department is the humanities, social and political sciences, but like we've historically had the fewest women out of every department, even math and physics here at ETH. So it remains clearly like part of the daily narrative. But I think one of the biggest things that I've learned and I've been really happy to embrace and try to take forward in everything I do in my day-to-day life is when you have a position of privilege, when you have a stable job, when you have, a modicum of power, however that might be envisioned, to use that to help others and to help, women, especially who are coming up behind me, and making sure that they're supported and they know what their rights are. They know, what they can ask for and what our male counterparts might be getting and being offered, but we might not be. So I think that's been a really important thing. But I won't go on to like a grand male bashing tour because I think I've had so many men in my career who've helped me like so very much, and it's more like, as a woman or a man or whoever one may be, finding the right place for you and your community and those people who enable you and build you up so that you can be who you need to be and who you must be, and a person that can to change the world for the better.
Well, one thing I can definitely say, Emily, is you are an awesome role model. You're definitely paving the way for women like me who are coming after you. But yeah, I definitely want to say that you're definitely a role model. You're awesome, and I think a lot of us look up to you. Not just me, but also I know a lot of other people do that as well. So thank you for the work you do. We really appreciate it.
But thank you for the feedback. You can't see me blushing on screen, but
oh well, this is a admiration club. We can call it that.
mutual admiration club, please.
But anyway, I guess moving on to now the last couple of questions, or statements, questions, comments, whatever. What's one advice you'd like to give young researchers in India and beyond who want to work at this intersection of art, science, technology? What's something that you've kind of learned and you'd like to pass on to the next generation of researchers?
I think be curious and brave in finding your own path. It's great to have role models. It's great to have people that you kind of, put into your kind of inspiration board of like, I want a career, I want to be something like that person, but also kind of be open to finding your own path, because sometimes the most perfect fit for your future career won't be something that someone's ever done before. So that takes a bit of courage and a bit of, putting yourself out there, but having some kind of near role models or mentors that can kind of help you find that path is a really important thing, but don't feel like it has to be a path that someone's tread before.
I think that is exceptional advice. Thank you very much, Emily. And I'm sure our viewers and listeners will definitely, benefit from this podcast and that piece of advice that you just gave.
And just your listeners should just, Google Kohinoor Darda, because she's done that exact thing so well. And in terms of creating one's own path and not having the roadmap for it, but making it a huge success, like Kohinoor, the founder of Arisa, is a wonderful role model in this regard.
Emily, you are too kind. I'm going to edit that from the podcast.
It's true. No, you can't. I will refuse this going up if you edit it out.
No, but okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I really do. But I also did have exceptional role models like yourself who did help with my journey, and I continue to do that and continue to be inspiration. So I'm really grateful for it. And I'm really grateful, Emily, once again. Thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. Really, really appreciate your time today. Really appreciate the conversation. And for our listeners and viewers, Emily did present at our unconference earlier this year as well. So if you're interested in listening to that talk, that's on our YouTube channel. You can find it in the Arisa Foundation's unconference playlist. But also we have the unconference coming again next year in March 2026, and we have amazing speakers who are going to come and be a part of that unconference. So this is an invitation for everyone to go check out our website and our Instagram, get to know a bit more about the unconference, which is India's first neuroaesthetics unconference. I'm so happy to call it that. Sounds very exciting.
It is very exciting. Awesome.
It's going to be awesome. So this is an invitation to our listeners and viewers to be a part of it. And Emily, I'd love it if you can be a part of it as well. Maybe remotely, we can figure that out. But yes, thank you so much once again for being a part of this podcast. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me and for starting the week off in such a wonderful way for me. So thank you, Kohinoor.